We've spent a lot of time talking about Football Manager, and frankly, I'm getting kind of tired of talking about Sports Interactive's problems. Instead, let's take a sensible break and look at a different old classic. Sure, it might be an arcade game, but this game really does hold up well after all these years. Well, if you're kind of geeky like me and you spend a whole bunch of time looking at old gaming magazines for reviews of games like, I don't know, the original Championship Manager, you'll notice a lot of people talking about a different game. That game would be Sensible Soccer, and it really was all the rage back then. But, you know, before we look at Sensible Soccer itself, we really need to spend some time looking at its history. So the original version of this game was a Japanese arcade game from 1985 called Tehkan World Cup. It was a flat-top game that looked like this. It used a trackball instead of a control pad, on some versions at least. You had a single button that you could use to perform any kind of action in the game. The setup was just about as simple as it gets, but how did the game play? Actually, this plays pretty well for a game from 1985. The top-down perspective takes a little bit of time to get used to, but it's not so bad once you get the hang of it. The biggest problem, though, is that passing makes little sense. It's easier to just run the ball up and take a shot when you're somewhere close to the goal. And so it's not exactly the best strategic game from that point of view. Now, the history of the company Tehkan is actually pretty interesting. It starts off a little bit trivial, but you'll see where I'm going with this. Tehkan is the short version of the old Japanese name Teikoku Kanzai, which means something like Imperial Asset Management. And I would say that's a pretty ambitious name for a company that started out creating cleaning supplies for janitors. And I'm not kidding about that either. That's what they started doing when they were founded in like 1967 or whatever. And that word Teikoku means empire. That's what it literally means. That's a pretty interesting name for a post-World War II period company started in Japan, at least in my opinion. Tehkan started off in the video game market with an arcade shooter in 1981 called Pleiades. Now, you might have heard of Bomb Jack, which was one of its early games. Anyway, around 1986, the company changed its name to Tecmo Limited, which is the name it used until it was dissolved in 2010. Tecmo, of course, was known for some of the best console sports games of the 1990s, such as Tecmo Super Bowl. In fact, Tehkan World Cup was eventually ported to the NES as Tecmo World Cup Soccer in 1990. But that's only one version of that game. You see, a few years after that arcade game was first released, Tehkan World Cup was the inspiration for a Commodore 64 game that was extremely influential. That would be this game, Microprose Soccer, the football simulation. Here in the United States, it was called Keith Van Aaron's Pro Soccer, though I'm not sure how many people actually bought it. And when you start this one up, you'll see near the beginning that it was programmed by Sensible Software. Yeah, you guessed it, that's where the sensible part of Sensible Soccer comes from. Anyway, Microprose Soccer is actually a really good game. It's a huge improvement over the Tehkan game, in my opinion. There are quite a few options from the start. The top-down perspective is the same, though the animations are improved and the flow of the game is much better. This game is also a lot more difficult than the old arcade game was. It also goes by really quickly. 1 minute is all you get in the default settings, and it feels like you don't have enough time to get the ball down the pitch, let alone actually do something with it. Now, the coolest part I experienced came in the second half of one of the games I played, where it started raining. Again, the weather animation here is really cool. I'd actually say this is a little bit better than how Football Manager deals with weather. The controls on the wet pitch felt the same to me, but then again, I didn't spend a whole ton of time playing this one. I was also surprised to see a replay system in place for when you score a goal, or in my case, when I gave up a goal. Anyway, this all seemed pretty advanced for 1988. Now, I should note that I played this one on a Commodore 64 emulator. There apparently were also ports out there for the Amiga, the Atari ST, and even MS-DOS. I really wanted to give the original a try though, and frankly, it's really good in my opinion for a Commodore game. The old reviews I found for this game were almost universally positive. In fact, the only negative review I found came from this old 1989 Swedish magazine called Datormagazin. However, if you look closely at the good reviews, you will notice a hint of negativity here and there. Anyway, that's what led up to Sensible Soccer, which came out in 1992 on the Amiga. Now, I will note that I only messed around with the original version, and yes, I know that version 1.1 features quite a few improvements. It took me a little while to figure out how to insert the second disc, but once I got that down, we were on our way. Now, the options in Sensible Soccer are amazing, even for 1992. I mean, the menus came in 4 languages right out of the box. You could choose from all sorts of game types. I count 34 different nations in all, which I think is really impressive. Each team comes with real player names too, as well as accurate colors. And you can choose from all sorts of different tactical styles. I should remind you again that this came out in 1992. It's not like an old Apple II game, of course, but this is still pretty early. It's well over 30 years ago now. This is pretty advanced stuff for 1992, in my opinion. The gameplay itself looks similar with that familiar top-down perspective. However, the gameplay itself is a little bit more advanced. So if you don't keep the ball in front of you, your player will run away and forget to take the ball with him. Even though your players try to maintain a tactical formation, it can be difficult to figure out how to get the ball to them. And the computer is pretty good. Well, I'm not very experienced with this game, which is the reason why I didn't do so well. That's the excuse I'm sticking with. With some practice, I'm pretty sure that anybody, even me, could become at least competent in this game. Well, the top-down perspective works a little bit better here. You can see a lot more. The pitch just feels larger. The game does seem to end quickly, though that's probably because I didn't change anything from the default settings. I know you can change the time of game if you want. Anyway, overall, this is a nice game, though it's pretty hard. Now, reviews of the game at the time noted both how small the players were and how hard the game was. Most magazines gave the original game good ratings, but noted that competitors such as Kickoff 2 were better. I do think some of these criticisms are a bit harsh, but then again, I also had some of the same problems that these reviewers had. Now, as you know, this is not the legendary version of Sensible Soccer. That one came a few years later, and that's another game that we'll look at in another video. Of course, I did have other reasons to want to mess around with the Amiga emulator. I wanted to check out the original Championship Manager, for example. I failed in my first attempt to get it working, though I'm not going to give up just yet. And I know that I can always just use the MS-DOS port instead, but anyway, stay tuned. Assuming that I get things working and get enough gameplay in, we will eventually also do a review of the original Championship Manager game, and we might as well look at some of its competitors as well. Anyway, talk to you later.